Well, I would say, all right, let's see it, but we've already seen it. In fact, we've seen this a lot over the last couple of years on social media. These claims are getting shared an awful lot. But let me just share briefly with you the consensus views on these claims. So we start off 1500 years. This would be if we presuppose the historicity of the biblical account, and we presuppose that the traditional assignment of authorship to the biblical texts is all true. And there's not really a good case to make for that. When we actually look at when the texts of the Bible were all composed, we get a span of around 1100 years. The earliest parts of the Bible are little fragments of poetry that may date to around 1000 BCE, maybe a little earlier. And then we go down to the most recent parts of the Bible, which are some of the letters from the New Testament and maybe like the Gospel of Luke, which are probably around the 120, 130 CE range. So again, we have around 1100 or so years for the composition of the entire Bible. Then we have the claim that there are 66 books. Well, this is according to the Protestant canon. So this is covering around the last 500 years of the existence of the Bible, which is not the majority of the existence of the Bible. There are a lot of different canons for a lot of different Christian communities that range from fewer than 66 books to more than 80 books. So this is just saying we like 66 books. This is not really making a point about anything. Then we have the claim that the Bible was written by 42 authors. Again, this is presupposing the traditional assignment of authorship, which is rejected by the overwhelming majority of scholars, because the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, were not written by Moses. That's silly. They were written by dozens of people. So right there, you've got to multiply the authorship by dozens and dozens. So that is not accepted by scholarship. Then we have the claim that there are 0 contradictions, which is laughable. The Bible is full of contradictions. But the people who make this claim are not able to think critically about this. And if you show them contradictions, they're going to object and they're going to present awful arguments that don't convince experts, that don't convince people that are capable of thinking critically. They only convince themselves, because that's the goal. When people put forward arguments against contradictions, they're not trying to convince other people. They're trying to put on display confidence and conviction and competence to others, but they're really trying to convince themselves that their position is plausible. And it's just not, and we're going to demonstrate that when I address the next claim, 66,537 cross-references. This is a ridiculous statement for a couple of reasons. To begin, this originates with a Bible cross-references chart created by Chris Harrison, and you can go to his website and order this chart if you want. I'm sure many of you have seen this image many times in recent years. And Chris Harrison put this together based on a list of cross-references that he and a pastor named Christoph Romhild put together back in 2007. And Chris Harrison defines a cross-reference as conceptual links between verses connecting locations, people, phrases, etc., found in different parts of the Bible. What a lot of people hear when they see this cross-references stat is that this was all intended by the authors. And this is simply not true. These are connections that we make looking at the text. These are not all intended by the author or some supernatural puppet master controlling what the authors are saying. And we don't even know what the average number of cross-references we can identify in a text of almost 800,000 words would be. We don't have a control to which we can compare this to see if this is actually a large number of cross-references or not. But what we do have is an image that Chris Harrison shares in his website when he gives an example of how Bibles often list cross-references in the margins or footnotes. And this is the image that he shares. The chunk of text that has 118 in red on the left, that's the set of cross-references right in the center of this image. And this is about Acts chapter 1, verse 18, which discusses the death of Judas. And here's what it says in Acts 1:18 and 19. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness. So Judas purchased a field, and then Judas was in that field. And falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. This became known to all the residents of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their language Hakeldama, that is, field of blood. So Judas bought a field, was in the field, fell down, and his bowels gushed out, and people called that field Field of Blood because of Judas's blood gushing out onto the field. This first cross-reference takes us to Matthew 27, 3 through 10. Here are those passages. And this discusses Judas's death again, but Matthew has altered the story. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money. Whose blood? Jesus' blood. After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. So in Matthew, Judas just goes and hangs himself, and it is the chief priests who purchase a field after Judas's death, and it is given the name Field of Blood because it was purchased with the blood money for Jesus's blood. So the first cross-reference that they list here is a contradiction that contradicts the account of Judas's death given in Acts 1, because there's nothing about hanging in Acts 1. It just says he fell down and all his blood gushed out. If he had hanged himself, the author of Acts 1 was being profoundly negligent as a storyteller by not mentioning, oh, he actually fell from being hanged rather than just tripped and fell, which is what the text makes it sound like. But there's more, because a lot of folks are going to say, well, there could have been a gust of wind and that turned and broke the rope, and then he fell down and his body, because it had already been decomposing, just burst open. Yeah, you can make up all the scenarios you want that are not in evidence to try to connect these dots if your priority is connecting these dots. If your priority is not connecting these dots, they don't connect. This is the part about dogmatism. You're not thinking critically if your goal is to make the dots connect. Without that goal, the dots just don't connect, because this is a contradiction. And this is where apologists will say, well, a contradiction by definition is two things that cannot possibly both be true at the same time. So they take a very narrow definition so that they can say it's not impossible that these two things are both true at the same time, therefore not a contradiction. But this is just looking for an escape route. This is just looking for an excuse. This is lowering the bar to the ground, because as long as you're allowed to make up whatever scenarios you want that are not in evidence to make two dots connect, then there's no such thing as a contradiction. Because you can connect any two contradictory stories as long as you're allowed to fabricate and just gin up any scenarios you want that are not in evidence. So that is not a good faith engagement of the claim that this is a contradiction. But it also ignores that the purchase of the field and the origin of the name Field of Blood also contradict. And it gets even more ridiculous when you hear people try to account for those contradictions, because they have to say, well, you could say that he purchased it because it was his money that they used to purchase the field. And that's laughable. That's not what Acts is saying. Acts is not saying that Judas purchased it in the sense that other people purchased it, but they used the money that they had temporarily given to him and that he had returned to them. Acts is very clearly not saying that. Again, This is trying to cross the bar that you have buried underground of saying it's only a contradiction if there is no physically, humanly, logically possible way to harmonize the two accounts. And again, if that's the standard, then there's no such thing as a contradiction. So it's silly to say there's 0 contradictions and 66,537 cross-references when the example that the person who came up with that number provides of cross-references begins with a clear contradiction. So this just demonstrates that these are not claims that are supported by any data. These are dogmatic claims about which these folks have not thought critically, that they are putting on display only to signal to others their commitment to the identity markers. This is praying on the street corner to be seen of men so that they can get their reward. And on social media, the reward are all the little digital pats on the butt from the other members of their community that make them feel justified and that make them feel like they belong to that community. It's identity politics all the way down, and these people need to learn to think critically and Google competently. And the fit for this video has been Gambit.